Hey everyone, I'm really honored to introduce Dr. Tiffany Wolf, who's my former PhD advisor and current mentor and colleague. I'm sure most of you know Dr. Wolf pretty well, but for those of you that might not, she's a wildlife epidemiologist and veterinarian that works across a variety of species, disciplines, cultures, and ecosystems, including the Brazilian Pantanal, Guianan rainforest, reservations across the state of Minnesota, and parks in our backyards. This breadth, I think, really demonstrates her incredible dedication to the ultimate goal of improving human, animal, and environmental health. And this study that Dr. Wolf is going to tell you about today, in which she worked with the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, to understand the driving forces behind the moose decline in northeast Minnesota. It's a long-term and multifaceted and creative study that has provided management insights that actually led to the highest moose count on the reservation in about a decade this year. So kind of a success story here. So anyway, thank you for coming and please enjoy the talk.
Thank you. All right, I am going to dive in by thinking about how we approach our complex health challenges of today. And we have three paradigms that offer us a more holistic way of approaching health, all recognizing that many of these health challenges result from our human impact, and to solve them, we really need to approach these challenges and systems, or with systems thinking and interdisciplinary collaboration and action. But each of these paradigms provide frameworks that approach these challenges through slightly different lenses. Where One Health really focuses on the health at the interface of humans and animals in a shared environment, ecosystem health does the same, but takes a deeper look at the structure and function of the environment and how that plays into the health of people and animals. And as the name suggests, planetary health zooms out and thinks about how the biophysical processes of our planet combined with the social, political, and economic activities of humans interact to affect the health of human civilizations. As an example, if we take deforestation from an One Health approach, I might look at how increased contact between humans and mosquitoes results in increased vector-borne diseases in humans. From an ecosystem health perspective, I might also think about the larger vector communities and other biodiversity in those areas, along with natural water cycling that has changed, to understand how these changes of health might be occurring at this new interface. And from a planetary health approach, I'll be thinking about this from the perspective of how the degradation of one of our important carbon sinks, like the Amazon forest, impacts health through the exacerbation of climate change around the globe. And so from an ecosystem health perspective, human health and well-being rest on functioning ecosystems that provide us with different services. And those include things like food and water and medicine, like flood and pathogen control, carbon and nutrient cycling, as well as spiritual and recreational benefits. And you can think of the building blocks that provide the structural support to these ecosystems as the biodiversity that make up our plant, animal, and microbial communities. And our biodiversity is in crisis. So this is data, 40 years of data that comes from the World Wildlife Fund that shows that 39% of our terrestrial populations, 39% of our marine populations, and 76% of our freshwater populations are disappearing. And there are a variety of threats that are driving this crisis that I'm not going to get into now, but we're going to bring this to Minnesota and think about how some of these factors may be at play here in the decline we've seen in moose. And so I'm going to start by showing moose in the context of its distribution or their distribution across North America, where you can see they extend from Alaska across Canada, and the southern extent of their range dips into some of our the northern states in our contiguous U.S., and that includes Minnesota. Historically, our moose population was distributed across much of the northern part of the state, but over time, this geographic extent has receded to now where it exists today in only the northeast corner of the state. When I arrived in Minnesota in 2006, the state was estimating our moose population size between 7,000 and 8,000 animals. And in a few short years after, we started to see this population plummet to half of that. And that's where we are today. And so Bill Severud, while he was doing a postdoc in my lab, created the figure on the left from data from three entities that had been monitoring moose since this decline. The black line is data that comes from the state's annual moose surveys, and really over the core of moose range shows how the population declined quite drastically, especially in the early 2000s. The orange line represents data that comes from the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Ojibwe. They are situated in the very farthest corner of this core range, farthest northeast corner. And they are also seeing or have been seeing a declining trend in moose like the state. The blue line is data that comes from Voyageurs National Park on the western portion of this core area. They have a much, much smaller population, which also is seemingly more stable. But I start there because all of these entities together started capturing and collaring moose at about the same time to try and understand causes of mortality that were driving this decline. And I'm going to focus in on the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa because these are the partners that I worked with. And so for those of you who are not familiar with this tribe, it's one of the earliest Ojibwe settlements in Minnesota. It exists on 43 acres of reservation land in the northeasternmost part of Minnesota. Our Grand Portage people are known for their trade in deer, or were known for their trade in deer, moose, maple syrup, and wild rice, which they still harvest today for tribal purposes. The Grand Portage Band, along with Bois Forte and Fond du Lac, ceded a large portion of what we know of northeastern Minnesota today, millions of acres, to the United States in the 1854 treaty. But they retained rights to hunt, fish, and gather in that territory. And that area comprises much of moose core range that we know today. And it's because moose are such a culturally important resource for the Grand Portage Ojibwe that they've really taken a leading role in trying to understand the drivers of this decline. So we knew going into this research that high adult and calf mortality were drivers of the Northeast population decline, but we didn't know the key causes of mortality, and we really didn't know how moose were using the habitat in this region. And so each year from 2010 to 2021, we captured and collared adult moose. And then in the spring of 2013 to 2018, we captured and collared or remotely monitored calving and calf survival. So I spent a lot of time in the woods with these three people, Seth Moore, E.J. Isaac, and Yvette Chanot Ibrahim, especially early on before we had grad students and postdocs that could help with data collection. But here you see the results from that work with the Grand Portage study represented from 2010 to 2021, shown on the left. And I'm also showing the Minnesota DNR's study results from 2013 to 2016 on the right. Between these two studies, what we've learned is that wolves have been responsible for a large portion of moose mortality. And a variety of disease processes have also been identified, which have been lumped in the gray portions of these pie charts. But parasitic diseases, particularly those or that caused by P. tenuis, also known as brainworm, have been associated with just about a quarter of mortalities observed in both studies. And I do want to note here that an obvious difference between the state and the Grand Portage charts is the size of the pie of hunter harvest. And the reason for that is in 2011, the state banned all recreational hunting of moose for state hunters. But the tribe continued to allow tribal hunters to harvest moose for subsistence purposes. And this was really, the importance of this was really exemplified during the pandemic when 90% of tribal members lost their source of economic income and really relied heavily on more of a subsistence lifestyle to thrive. And so again, this just reiterates the importance of these wildlife species like moose for the band. What these charts don't show is that, or one of the things that I want to point to is the fact that what we're looking at here are the immediate causes of mortality, but they don't show predisposing factors. So as an example, wolf predation is a really important cause of mortality, but what we don't see here is that we learned from these studies a lot of the moose that were killed by wolves had underlying health conditions, including P. tenuis, that likely contributed to their vulnerability to predation. These data are from Grand Portage's calf collaring studies. We observed 84% of mortality of our study calves. And as you can see here, predators are the primary culprit. Interestingly, we saw almost equal levels of wolf and bear predations on our calves. And this is important to note because, we're thinking about this in the context of how do we translate these research findings into management actions. And for most of the time that we have been studying this moose decline, wolves have benefited from federal protection through the Endangered Species Act. And so they cannot be managed by our Grand Portage or state managers. So we saw pretty early on that wolves were a really important cause of both adults and calf mortality. But where adults were concerned, many of those adults had underlying health conditions, including P. tenuis. But P. tenuis, all on its own, we saw popping out as an important cause of adult mortality. And we really had to pay attention to the fact that our calves and recruitment into the reproducing population was being hampered by high levels of predation by both wolves and bears. So after our first 3 years of study, Grand Portage managers felt like they had enough data to justify a spring bear hunt. And again, wolf management was not on the table, but bears were not under federal protection. And so a spring bear hunt was implemented from 2016 to 2019. And after the first year, we were no longer seeing calf predations related to bears. And so bear predations are represented in the blue and wolves in the orange. But even more exciting is that we also saw an increase in calf survival into the winter, where we started around 26% calf survival, and that improved to 39% calf survival. But this experiment continued. There was no hunt in 2020 because of the pandemic, and a single hunt in 2020 was implemented, but thereafter, there were no more spring bear hunts. And that was because tribal members with kinship to the Bear Clan were vocally opposed to the use of bear hunting to manage bears on the reservation. And they were able to persuade the tribal council to to prevent this as a management action moving forward. And this is a really clear example of where science and culture can come into conflict. And it's because the cultural benefit was at risk. This management action could no longer be supported. And so back to the drawing table we went, and we decided to focus a bit more on P. tenuis. And so to do this, I want to spend a little bit of time, because we spent a lot of time thinking about the system of P. tenuis. And oftentimes, especially in veterinary medicine, we're just looking at the life cycle of the parasite, right? And so the life cycle of this parasite is that their definitive hosts are deer, white-tailed deer specifically. The sexual reproduction occurs within the meninges of the brain. The larvae are excreted in their feces, where gastropods take up those larvae, which develop to infectious stages. And then as deer or moose are browsing the landscape, inadvertently consume these gastropods on plant matter. And if in deer, that life cycle begins again after migration through back to the meninges of the brain. And in moose, they go on a bit more of an aberrant migration that tends to take them through the tissues of the nervous system that manifests in clinical disease, severe clinical disease that ultimately can result in mortality. I also have wolves present on the system and our forest landscape, because again, we're taking an ecosystem health view of this system and thinking about all the levers we have or managers have that they might be able to act on. And starting with the gastropods, we ask the question, can we mitigate transmission through gastropods with forest management? And forest management was already happening on the reservation for cultural, economic, and ecological benefits. And so we explored gastropod community responses to different forest management treatments and time since treatment, as well as soil properties and cover type and gastropod species, with particular attention to the gastropod species that were known hosts for P. tenuis. And we conducted gastropod surveys across 71 sites, which included both managed and unmanaged sites. And what was found was that overall gastropod communities were suppressed with forest treatments, but we really only saw this in the first 5 years after forest management occurred. And after that, the communities tend to return to look more like what unmanaged forests look like. But we also saw that responses to management varied by gastropod species, particularly among the known hosts like Drosera slaviae, or Drosera species in general, Discus, and Succinea. They vary differently, where some increased immediately after forest treatment, others decreased immediately after forest treatment, and others we really didn't see much change at all. And so this study really raised more questions. We didn't get to look at, for example, how fire impacts. There's more interest in returning to using fire or prescribed fire to manage forests. But between this study and another study, we felt like forest management may provide greater nutritional benefits rather than direct parasite control. And the reason for this comes from a second study that we did where we looked across, we looked at twig production, clearly outside of my discipline, twig production and moose browsing across different tree species and shrub species that have been managed in Grand Portage. We looked at that over time and saw that managing for diverse mixes of deciduous trees and shrubs that results in post-harvest treatments can really provide much longer term nutritional benefits for moose than just simple clear cutting our Minnesota forests that result in the return of mostly aspen stands alone. So, returning to the life cycle and thinking more about the vulnerabilities within that might be leveraged for management to support our moose population. From a risk perspective, it's really thinking about where on the landscape these three species, the moose, the deer, and the gastropods, are overlapping. But a fourth species, wolves, we might also consider, because we know that they are influencing these populations both through the direct lethality or predation of these animals and impacts on their density, but also because of behavioral responses of these prey to the presence of wolves. And we're thinking about that because why is this not, there we go. Nope. You're waiting with bated breath, right? We're looking at other systems like the Yellowstone system, where researchers have been showing that elk will respond to wolf pressure, where in areas where there's very little wolf use, they will prefer using more open and aspen stands. But as wolf use increases on the landscape, that habitat selection switches to more conifer cover types where they can find refuge, better refuge. So in Grand Portage, if wolf distribution and presence on the landscape influences deer and moose behavior, then depending on their responses, we might observe one of two things. If deer and moose are selecting the same habitat in response to wolves, then we might see greater habitat overlap and thus more risk of P-tenuous transmission to moose. But if they have a differential selection of habitat types in response to predation levels, that could be a good thing because that may mean less habitat overlap and less transmission to moose by P-tenuous. And so we had a great opportunity with wolves, deer, and moose all collared over the same study period, as well as annual surveys that had been conducted for all of these species that were combined. We had a faculty member from Brazil who spent his sabbatical working with my lab as a spatial ecologist. He combined these data sets to model how deer and moose selected habitat in response to wolves. And so what we're looking at here from top to bottom, this is different parts of the season. Or top, we go from winter, spring to summer. In green, we have moose. In purple, we have deer. And gold is the habitat that they are sharing. And on the left panel, this is average wolf predation pressure based on the number of wolves and where their activity is happening on the landscape. And we see as the seasons progress into summer, there's greater overlap of habitats between deer and moose. The next panel, the right panels, are the same seasons, but now this is being modeled at the lowest levels of wolf predation pressure. And I think what is most obvious is this gold, the shared habitat is really popping. And it's really popping in the spring and the summer. Where summer, we're seeing an increase of 50% of shared habitat, and spring, an increase of 80% of shared habitat. And these are key seasons for P-tenuous transmission because gastropods are also active on the landscape. And in the spring, that's when scientists have seen the greatest shedding of larvae by deer. And so through this study, we were able to uncover that wolf predation risk is associated with habitat selection, primarily by deer. And importantly, the results, or that can result in an increase in the spatial segregation of deer and moose, which can ultimately decrease P. tenuis transmission risk. And what I didn't talk about with the previous slide is moose that died with P. tenuis infection were using 25% more of those risky habitat areas than moose that did not have P. tenuis infection. This also tells us, though, that if the time comes when wolves are no longer federally protected, any wolf management would need to be combined with ongoing surveillance for P. tenuis mortalities in moose, because we might expect that that's going to increase as wolf numbers decrease on the landscape. But the glimmer of hope in this really complex system is that combined deer management could mitigate parasite transmission risk. And we know this with the exciting modeling that was done by Tyler Garwood, using, again, our long-term mortality data set, where we see here in purple a model of P. tenuis mortalities at the population level over time, and in orange, wolf predation levels. And our P. tenuis mortality starts to drop off as what we see here is deer density. Deer density is also declining. So as deer density declines, we're seeing fewer P. tenuis mortalities in moose. What this shows us is that adaptive management strategies must address both parasite and predation risk if we really want to be successful in restoring moose populations. Okay, I want to conclude by returning to one of the core principles of these holistic frameworks I introduced at the beginning of the study, which is that this interdisciplinary research needs to be translated into action. And so during the 55th North American Moose Conference, which was held in Grand Portage in 2023, we worked with 145 of the participants to conduct a workshop that centered around the co-stewardship of moose. And that included representatives from Indigenous nations, federal, state, provincial governments, academia, and non-governmental agencies. And from that workshop, we produced a guiding document for the restoration and that created a restoration and co-stewardship framework. And that's now being translated into policy that's currently under consideration by our state legislature. All of this work could not have been done with a lot of people across a lot of different disciplines. And there are names on this slide and faces in this room that were part of that. And so much of this credit and celebration of this work goes to that collaboration. But in my mind, the experiment is not done. The success is going to be, as Tyler pointed to, seeing our moose populations rebound to the place where they were, but seeing all of these people work together and come together on a united front, I have a lot of reason for optimism and hope. And I don't know if I have time for questions. Thank you.
Curious how the deer management is achieved. Is it through hunter-harvested? Is it sharpshooting? Because the reason I ask is that that's a commonly used management tool for chronic wasting disease, and it's shown that it often leads to hunter fatigue and ultimately failure in those types of management actions. So I'm curious how it's managed in that system.
The decline in deer in Grand Portage was initially driven by weather conditions, several years of weather condition that really knocked that deer population down. And the Grand Portage management agency took advantage of that to follow up with additional management strategies that really focused on increasing harvest. So they did no culling, but they relied on harvest to keep those numbers down. Alonso?
Curious about the bear situation that you described. So drawing a parallel to the wolves, it sounded like if you introduce more wolf pressure, potentially you can minimize the overlap between deer and moose. Yeah. How does that work with the bear thing? You increase overlap, or it seems like with the bear reintroduction, if you will, there was a greater impact, negative impact on the moose population.
Yeah, so and it was really just it's bear hunting that they were trying to use to take that pressure off of the calves. Bears are really primarily only important when it comes to calves, and we saw their impact really within the first almost 2 weeks after parturition. So that is a time when bears are emerging from hibernation. They're incredibly food motivated. Um, and this is the most vulnerable species on the landscape. I think that they are opportunistic hunters. I don't think that we impacted the bear density, but what instead happened because hunters use large bait piles to attract bears, we shift their feeding preferences at a time when those moose calves were most vulnerable. And so and I think that's an important consideration because, perhaps that's a different kind of tool. Yeah. But anyway, it's just a short window with the bears. And so we didn't have bears collared to be able to monitor their behavior, but also weren't highly motivated to collar bears to answer that question because it's such a short window of time that they were really having an impact.